When we talk about mediation, we refer to a conflict-solving practice where a third party enters as an intermediary of the conflict with the aim of helping the first parties to find a solution that they have not been able to find themselves. Mediation as conflict is found in nearly all aspects and levels of our lives and society. When there is a civil war or international dispute, sometimes other states or organizations decide to intervene to mediate the conflict. All along this essay, we are going to analyze mediation in that last scenario. In this report, we are going to try to explain why countries would be interested in mediating a conflict, why one parties would or not accept such mediations, as well as try to analyze which are the best techniques and strategies used in conflict mediation at the states level. Mediation is a process more usual than we may think at the very beginning. There is a documented trend showing that mediations tend to take place more often in intrastate conflicts as civil wars, rather than in interstate disputes since the end of the 1980s. Nonetheless, in general lines, mediation level seems to be higher than those of the Cold War according to some specialists. In the last decades, there has been an increase on the number of actors willing to be involved in mediation processes. There is a lower participation of intergovernmental organizations, while regional organizations are tending to be more involved in such procedures. However, once mediation by regional powers or organizations does not work or fails on its procedures, it tends to be the United Nations the one taking the role of mediator. An example can be the attempts of conflict resolution in the Israeli and Palestinian case, when the United Kingdom, from its role of mediator as the colonizer of the territory, passes the ball to the UN General Assembly, which gave birth to the famous UN resolution of the two states of 1947. It is also a fact needed to highlight the idea that the frequency of mediation in conflicts in the African continent is proportionate to its share of armed conflicts in the world. Meanwhile, Europe and in the Middle East are two world areas that seem to receive a disproportionate amount of mediations, taking into account its global share of conflicts. In the case of the Middle East, it is due to the excessive interference in the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Added to the above, according to the general data, the United States is the country the most engaged in mediation worldwide, in any attempt to increase and maintain its influence worldwide, or at least it has been the trend until the end of the Obama presidency and the rise of Trump to power, while China, following its more isolated foreign policy strategy, happens to be the world power the least involved in mediation processes. The first and main question I would like to discuss is why states would be interested in mediation, both from the mediator role as from the party's position. Why would a state be interested in another one interfering on its own conflicts? And why would a peaceful state be interested in getting involved in someone else's conflict? Mediation, especially in the world of international relations, is not an altruistic act for the good of the world community necessarily, but part of the diplomatic exercise and strategy as a foreign policy tool. In the same sense, accepting or denying foreign mediation is also a card that can be played depending on the own interest of the parties involved, rather than because of thinking on the common good of their peoples. Countries, according to Zarman and Tuval on its article International Mediation in the Post-Cold War Era, are willing to mediate in other conflicts, mainly because of two main reasons. On one hand, because of the shared desire of humanity to achieve peace in the world. On the second hand, and maybe being that one the greatest motivation of both, in an aim to fulfill their own interests. As part of human nature, and this being even more accentuated at the states level, for individuals and for states, self-interest tends to be the greatest motivation of all, since in the anarchic and selfish international context, it happens to be even more common. Referring to states, the authors distinguish between two kinds of motivation or interests, offensive and defensive interest. Defensive interests are those related with promoting international stability and protecting own foreign interests, as with preventing rival countries to expand their influence, this meaning containment strategies, or as a more preventive tactic, acting afraid of the possibility of the conflict affecting their own territory. Opposite to that, offensive interests are those mainly related with the pursuit of the state to increase their influence. In this last case especially, states tend to be less interested in resolving the conflict, but they understand the mediation as a tool to benefit from. When referring to smaller and less powerful countries, taking the role as a mediator can also be used as a tool of soft power, as they may lack other foreign policy tools to spread their influence. An example could be the case of Cuba or Norway participating in international mediation of the Colombian conflict between the government and Las FARC. As another great example of how interest can motivate the role of a mediator, Zarman and Tuval, in 1996, tell us about the US diplomacy during the Cold War. During the years of the expansive tensions, the US quickly moved to get the role of a mediator in proxy wars, with the aim of spreading its influence and at the same time avoiding the USSR of doing so, what we were naming as offensive strategy. However, once the Cold War came to an end, the United States proved to be less interested in taking the role of mediator, as mediation had not anymore this containment value before the USSR, thus the United States had lost one of its greatest motivations for mediation. Following this very same logic of the motivation by self-interest, accepting mediation or not is also a decision based on a cost-benefit calculation of the consequences of mediation. State parties in a conflict tend to only accept mediation if they consider they will achieve a better outcome than if denying it, or if denying such mediation would lead to greater harms. The reasons to accept or deny mediation can be related not only with the mere outcome of the conflict, but they can also imply more strategical consequences, as affecting diplomatic relations with other countries or affecting the state roles within IGOs. To be accepted by the parties, mediators must be perceived as having an interest in reaching an acceptable outcome for both parties. Added to the above, for a successful mediation to take place, it does not only depend on the interest of the parties involved in the process, but also has to occur in the proper moment and context of the given conflict. Mediation must take place in a moment where both conflictual parties are willing to rethink their processes or policies and or reshape their strategies. If there is no will of the parties to accept possible changes to their strategy, thus they keep an immobilizing position, no mediation or negotiation itself will lead to any outcome. States can reach the point of accepting to reshape their strategies in the conflicts in two different scenarios. First of all, when parties find themselves in a situation of mutually harmful stalemate, this meaning that both parties realize that they will not be able to achieve their goals nor solve the conflict by following the same means. Secondly, it may occur in a situation of impending crisis for both countries, that meaning that both parties realize the fact that they cannot afford to keep suffering such losses or facing such catastrophes for human, economic, or political reasons. Nonetheless, Wallenstein and Svensson make a differentiation on the chances of accepting a mediation depending on the nature of the conflict, differentiating between if it is a national internal conflict, a civil war, or if it is an international conflict involving more than one state actor. According to them, parties in civil wars tend to be more reluctant to accept foreign mediation and tend to accept such offer only in the most serious and harmful situations. However, parties in international conflicts tend to be more willing to involve mediators in the conflict-solving process. This is explained by the fact that in a civil war, where one of the parties is the government and the other the opponents of the same, accepting such external mediation may be considered as legitimizing the opponent of the government in the conflict, hence legitimizing the ruling government. According to some data gathered by the Belgian Center for Research on Peace and Development, by December 2011 there was 8.1 cases of civil wars where mediation had been offered but not accepted. In 11.9% of cases, a ceasefire had been reached. 23.3% of them ended up on a partial agreement, and as the most significant data, 53.6%, meaning more than half of them, episodes of mediation resulted unsuccessful. Added to all the above, and according to some authors, the acceptance of the need of external mediation or the appearance of the interest to mediate tends to be achieved at later stages of the conflict. If we want to increase the probabilities of success in mediation, the possible mediator needs to arise in the minds of the conflictual parties the need of a regulated mediation in early stages of the conflict. For a successful and effective mediation, mediator stage organizations tend to follow three main steps or techniques. First of all, at the early stages of the mediation process, the third party uses to focus on assisting the communication process between the parties, building communication bridges and ties. Secondly, once communication is established, thus negotiation has started, the mediator must focus on acting as a formulator, this meaning to provide a formula to design the negotiation process for it to be effective. Finally, once a negotiation formula has been established, adopted, and seems to work, the role of the mediator should be to push or manipulate both parties by using its leverage or its power to bring the parties into an acceptable agreement for them. The efficiency of a mediator in a conflict can depend on two different aspects: the existing trust the parties may have towards the mediator, or the power or leverage the mediator can have to impose sanctions or give rewards to coerce the parties in the conflict. Depending on if the mediator considers that rather power or trust are the key element of the mediating project, they will use different strategies. Defining which is the best strategy for a mediator process to be successful has been one of the main questions for researchers on mediation, a key question that there is no consensus on its answer. Focusing on the classification made by Tuval and Zarman, we can distinguish between three main strategies of mediation. First, the formulative mediation, consisting on a more procedural and less coercive strategy. Secondly, and really close to the first one, the facilitative mediation strategy, being a more communicative procedure. And finally, the manipulative mediation, this being a much more direct and coercive strategy than the two above. Other authors, however, prefer to focus on the most pragmatic conception of influence, considering the leverage of or powers of the mediator as the element defining the strategy followed. Some authors would consider the facilitative and formulative mediation strategies happen to be more useful in territorial or secessionist conflicts, whereas the use of manipulative strategies by international mediation in national conflicts tend to make parties lose their trust on the third party, thus normally it's less successful in reaching favorable outcomes. However, some authors argue that a powerful mediator who can play a coercive mediation strategy can achieve more effective outcomes. If the state is powerful enough to influence on the resources of countries in conflict, or to offer rewards for peace, the country will have the leverage necessary to achieve efficient settlement in the conflict. Greater the power, greater the chances for the mediation to be successful. At the very end, mediators leverage their power depends not only on their resources but on the acceptance of the mediator by the parties involved in the conflict, what also depends on the perception of its likelihood of producing acceptable outcome. To sum it up, the leverage of a country depends or has 5 different sources. First, the ability of persuasion, this meaning the country's ability to revise parties' perceptions of the cost of the conflict and desirability of settlement. Secondly, the country's ability to come up with an attractive proposal. Thirdly, mediators may threaten to withdraw at some point negotiations, so they force parties to reprove their interest on having a mediator. Fourth, the capability and willingness to use sanctions to worsen one's or both situations and increase their motivation for settlement. And fifth, the capability and willingness to offer incentives in exchange of settlement. Nonetheless, no matter if depending on the leverage of the country or if depending on the strategy developed, there is no clear consensus on which or how mediation should be done for it to have greater chances of success and for settling unstable and long-lasting peace. A mediator needs to find a point in between official and unofficial tracks to achieve the most efficient outcome. A combination between trust and power should be achieved. However, the question is when should we prioritize trust and when we should prioritize power. Bernovich and Gardner define a way to distinguish in which conflicts trust is more important than power, and the other way around. They distinguish between high-intensity and low-intensity conflicts. Procedural and non-coercive strategies seem to be more effective in low-intensity conflicts, while in high-intensity ones, it seems to be more effective the use of coercive mediation by powerful countries. Added to the strategical aspect of mediation, there are many other fields within the topic where no consensus has been able to be reached by academics and researchers. There is a great discussion behind the question of whether mediators should be completely impartial and external to the conflict, or if biased mediators can bring a faster and more effective solution to the conflict. Some authors argue that having a partisan mediator will help find a solution to the conflict, while others consider impartiality as a key element for the success of the mediation. Another element of discussion is the so known as the coordination problem. It focuses on the argument of whether mediation should be coordinated between more than one mediator, or if that makes the mediation process less effective and there is no clear leadership role. However, according to other authors, if many actors participate in the mediation process, each one has its own motivations and mediation passes to be a foreign policy tool. After all that has been seen, we should determine if mediation is a useful tool for effective and efficient conflict resolution or it is not. According to Rosa MacLeod, who studied the impact of mediation in a long-lasting and stable peace, in conflicts where a mediation process has taken place, such conflicts had been associated with more long-lasting and stable peaces. However, in cases where it has been applied a power mediation, this meaning using coercive means towards belligerent parties of the conflict, the reappearance of conflict or fighting has been more probable. At the very end, mediation should have 2 main goals. First of all, ending with the short-term effects of the wars, that is the killings, the impoverishment, the carnage. Secondly, ensuring and stabling a long-lasting peace. If we keep these goals as the primary ones, and we manage to leave the self-interest motivation in a second scope, we will manage to achieve greater and more effective outcomes. Understanding greater and more effective as establishment of a long-lasting and rooted peace, and ending with the episodes of violent or non-violent conflict. Nonetheless, there is something key that we should take into account when we talk about mediation. Mediation, to some extent, is a new form of interventionism. No matter the reasons or motivations behind of it, mediation is a tool that aids to the interference and imposition of a foreign country into another's issues. Related with that idea, some authors' research have suggested that the most effective and durable peace agreements happen to be the ones with the less foreign intervention. Mediation has always and will always be needed in conflict-solving disputes in all aspects of life and society, since conflict will always be intrinsic to the nature of the community. Nonetheless, instead of appealing to mediations in an early stage or as a unique resource, maybe we should, as the community, offer and teach ourselves the tools and the know-how to solve internal disputes by ourselves. According to some authors, when the mediator is someone from the same community suffering the conflict, the results achieved tend to have greater chances of success. So at the very end, maybe the question should not be whether if mediation or non-mediation, but if foreign or internal. To sum it up, the field of mediation, as many others within international relations, is a field where no consensus is reached, as different experiences offer us different answers or analysis. We should try to use our tools in the most efficient and effective way as possible, always understanding mediation as a tool to help the people involved in the conflict to put an end to it, for the benefit of all the parties, rather than as a tool to exert some influence in a world region. Once countries or organizations start making from the common good their main priority, rather than thinking on private interest, every outcome reached will be an improvement for the people suffering the conflict. If we are not able to live in peace among us, let's at least try to learn how to solve our problems.